So I just got finished creating this Pyro source spread node in GeoNodes for Blender, and this was inspired by the Pyro source spread node from Houdini, which does exactly the same thing. So in Houdini, you assign a temperature attribute to a group of points, and then using the Pyro source spread, you can calculate how heat would spread and burn through the surface. And you can add in noise and stuff to the fuel and the temperature, etc. So with a new scene in Blender, I've got this basic grid with 64 subdivisions, and you need subdivisions for the Pyro source spread to work. So I'm going to crank that up to 512, and I'll drop in the Pyro source spread. Now for the Pyro source spread node to work, you need a source object, so you can just create an empty plane axis and move that somewhere on the plane, and then you can now go and select the empty as the source object, and then to view these attributes you can just create a viewer node and plug that in, and then you can plug in the temperature and highlight it. So if we press play, something happens, but not much, and that's because we still need to plug in a fuel field. So this is where you can plug in image textures or noise textures, whatever you want, and it will make the Pyro source spread kind of move in a nice natural way. So if I just plug in a noise texture, I'll do a scale of 3, detail of 8, and roughness of 0.6. And now if we press play, you've got the, there you go, the Pyro source spread. So you've got these steps per frame. If you increase this, it'll just increase the rate at which this grows out. Simple. You got the radius, and this is the radius from your empty. So if I take that down, we get a smaller start point. If I take it up, we get a bigger start point. You have the start temperature. This is just the initial temperature that you start off with. I don't know why in some cases it might be more useful to start with a higher temperature if your texture is really kind of dark. I'll leave it at 1. I already explained the fuel field. The diffusion iterations controls how much we blur out the spread attribute. So if you do 1, it doesn't really look as good. But if you go too high as well, it can look a bit stupid as well. So actually that's kind of cool. I take that back, that's not too bad. Anyway, by default it's at 8. You get the cooling rate. So if you don't have any cooling rate, it means the temperature will never dissipate, everything will stay wet. But if you do have a cooling rate, it means things will fade out quicker. Like so. The ignition temperature is the threshold for when the fuel will actually catch fire and burn. So if you have a really high ignition temperature, it's going to be unlikely for the rest of the plane to actually catch fire, and so you can see that it just kind of fades out. So if I bring that even higher, if I do 2, it's not even gonna go anywhere. So if you have an ignition temperature of 0, it means basically everything should catch fire at some point. Speaking of catching fire, here you can visualize the burn attribute as well, which will basically just show you the white outline of what's actually burning. Here you have the fuel, so it'll show you what has been burnt, what hasn't been burnt, so what still needs to catch and what has already been burnt and is now gone. And then you have the total burn, which you can use to delete geometry based on what has been burnt. So you can do some really cool stuff if you plug in image textures into the fuel fields as well. So right now I'm just visualizing the fuel, but if I visualize the temperature now so we can see how this grows. Yeah, not too bad. And of course you can further mess with these attributes. So I could do a blur attribute on the outside and crank up the iterations. Get something a bit softer. Can mess with it even more. If I do a math node, multiply, and a math node, power. So I can crank the power up to 3 and multiply up the strength, and then get a ramp, and we can do like black to red to yellow to white. So let's just distribute stops evenly. So that looks pretty cool. So I could just use this on Suzanne as well. You can see I'm plugging in the Suzanne, and I got a noise texture which I'm ramping, so I get a bit more contrast in there. Pretty much default settings. Oh, I left the ignition temperature at 0, but pretty much default settings. So yeah, if you're interested, you can go to the link in the description, get it from Gumroad.